The river is frozen at the edges, but not in the center. Dark water moves beneath a skin of ice, carrying broken reeds and the occasional body past the Roman camp. The sentries have learned not to look too long. There are always more. Beyond the far bank, the land rises into forests that never quite belong to Rome. Even in daylight they seem unfinished, a world without lines or limits. At night, fires appear and disappear among the trees. No one knows how many people are out there, only that they are closer than they were last year. The camp is awake before dawn. Axles creak. Men cough in the cold. Somewhere iron is being hammered back into use. This is not the clatter of an army preparing for conquest. It is the sound of a machine being kept alive one morning at a time. Inside a leather tent near the center of the camp, the emperor is writing. There is nothing ceremonial about it. No scribes, no witnesses, no audience, just a man in his 40s, already worn thin, putting short, hard sentences onto wax and parchment. They are not orders, they are not laws, they are reminders, instructions addressed inward, as if the mind itself were something that required discipline and maintenance, like a frontier or a wall. Do not assume this will end soon. Do not confuse exhaustion with truth. Do not let anger decide for you. This is where Marcus Aurelius spends much of his reign, not in marble halls, but in places like this, moving along the empire's raw edges as they fray. The capital is far away. Rome still functions, still stages rituals, still believes in continuity. But the real work of holding the world together has shifted outward, to rivers, roads, and temporary camps where nothing feels permanent anymore. Something has gone wrong with the rhythm of things. The wars here do not conclude. They pause, resume, spread. The enemy does not behave like an enemy Rome recognizes. They arrive not as armies alone, but as families, survivors, whole peoples pressed forward by forces no one in this camp fully understands. The seasons no longer reset the conflict. Each spring brings the same problem back, heavier than before. And behind all of it hangs a deeper unease, unspoken but felt. Too many men are missing. Too many farms are quiet. Too many replacements arrive already sick. The empire still moves, still obeys commands, but it does so without surplus, without confidence. Every decision now consumes something that cannot easily be replaced. Marcus Aurelius did not come here to change the world. He came here to keep it from breaking all at once. What survives of him is a book that speaks calmly about accepting limits, about the narrow space between what can be controlled and what cannot. Read later, it sounds serene. Read here, in the cold, it sounds different. It sounds like a ruler learning how to govern when peace is no longer an available condition. That is the problem of his reign. Not how to rule well in good times, but how to remain human and functional when the world you are responsible for no longer cooperates. The tent flap stirs. A draft slides in with the smell of smoke and damp wool. Somewhere outside, a horn calls the watch to change. The sound is muffled, as if the cold itself is thick. Marcus sets the tablet down and listens long enough to locate the note of fatigue in the camp's noises, the small irritations that grow into mistakes, the cough that will become fever, the argument that will become a knife. A messenger waits, stamping his feet, holding a roll sealed with clay. In Rome, it would be delivered with ceremony. Here it is, handed over like bread. Marcus breaks the seal, reads quickly, and gives it back with a few words that will send men to one road and not another. Then he returns to the private page, the one no one will see, and writes again as if to bind himself to the day's work. He has learned by necessity that an empire is not governed by grand ideas. It is governed by mornings like this, and by the part of the mind that does not flinch. Rome, when he first came to it as ruler, was built to hide such mornings. The city was stone and ritual, a theater of permanence. If the frontier was where history happened, the capital was where history was denied. In March of 161, the Palatine Hill was already warm with spring. Antoninus Pius, the emperor who had ruled for more than 2 decades with almost stubborn steadiness, lay dying in his residence. He was the kind of ruler the empire rewarded, cautious, pious, administrative. Under him, the state had grown fat on habit. The Senate met, the courts functioned, the provinces sent their taxes, and the legions stood at their posts more as boundary markers than as instruments of conquest. Antoninus had been chosen by Hadrian, and he in turn had been required to adopt a successor. The system had become a sort of engineered continuity. Rome had learned, after the chaos of earlier centuries, to treat succession as a problem of statecraft, not blood. A child could be charming or monstrous. Adoption could be arranged, a ladder of competence built by law. Marcus had been placed on that ladder young. He was born Marcus Annius Verus into a respectable family and pulled early into the imperial orbit. As a boy, he was marked out for seriousness. Tutors praised his austerity, his lack of vanity, his habit of sleeping on the floor in philosopher's dress until the household begged him to stop. He was trained in rhetoric, then in philosophy, and he absorbed the Stoic habit of speaking to himself as if the self were both student and teacher. He was also trained in something harder to name, the discipline of appearing calm under observation. Rome had many masters. One of them was the gaze. When Antoninus died, Marcus did not become emperor alone. The adoptive machinery produced not a single successor, but 2. Marcus and Lucius Verus, another adopted son of Antoninus, younger and more openly fond of pleasure. Marcus insisted that Lucius share the rank. It was an act of legality and prudence, but also of temperament. Marcus did not want the burden to be seen as seized. He wanted it borne, and borne correctly. The Senate approved. The people cheered. The coins were struck with 2 heads and paired titles. In the public language of Rome, it was an age of concord. In the private language of governance, it was a calculation made under the shadow of a problem Rome could feel but had not yet named. The empire was enormous. It ran on roads, letters, and the assumption that emergencies would be local. What it did not handle well was synchronized pressure, crises that arrived in different provinces at the same time and demanded attention before messengers could even reach the capital. The first demand came from the east. In Armenia, a client kingdom that lay between Rome and Parthia like a hinge, the old balance was broken. The Parthian king moved his own candidate onto the Armenian throne. Roman authority was challenged with a gesture that was both political and symbolic, a reminder that the empire's far edges could be tested. It did not look at first like a catastrophe. Rome had fought Parthia before. It had won and won again. These wars were expensive but familiar. An emperor could send legions and generals, and time would do the rest. Still, there was the question of presence. In an age that prized the emperor's visibility, not merely as a ruler but as a living guarantee of legitimacy, it mattered where he was seen to be. Marcus remained in Rome, tied to the capital's institutions and the need to appear steady. Lucius Verus was sent east, the junior emperor, a figurehead of imperial resolve. It was a division of labor and of risk. Lucius traveled with the full weight of the Roman state behind him, standards, guards, bureaucrats, speechwriters, the great rolling caravan of power. He made his headquarters at Antioch, the luxurious city near the borderlands where Roman and Greek worlds mixed easily. He was young, handsome, and, according to hostile sources, distractible. He raced, watched games, kept company. Meanwhile, the war was fought by the men who always fought Rome's wars: generals, staff officers, centurions, and the slow, relentless competence of the legions. In the East, the campaign was not romantic. It was road building, river crossing, siege work, and the management of supply. It was also a lesson in the empire's dependence on human organization. When the system worked, Rome's power felt like nature itself. When it failed in small humiliations: a missing convoy, a spoiled grain shipment, a commander's jealousy. The Romans pushed back into Armenia, then deeper. Cities fell. The Parthian capital region was reached. There were triumphal reports sent to Rome, lists of captured standards, names of towns taken. The empire performed the old rituals of victory, as if to reassure itself that the ancient rhythm had returned: challenge, response, conquest, celebration. Somewhere along those marches, whether in the press of soldiers in a captured city, or in the crowded markets of Mesopotamia, or in the intimate filth of camps where men slept too close, something else moved with the army. Galen, the physician whose writings would outlive the emperor's, later described a sickness he saw: fever, throat inflammation, eruptions on the skin, the body breaking down in ways that seemed both ordinary and horrifying. The exact nature of the disease has been debated since, because ancient descriptions are never clinical in the modern sense, and because epidemics leave traces that do not match cleanly to one pathogen. What matters is simpler. The disease did what diseases do when they meet roads, cities, and armies. It exploited connection. The legions returned. They returned with pay chests, trophies, and victory titles. They also returned with coughs, fevers, and the first deaths that looked like bad luck. The sickness moved from camp to town, from town to city, and then through the great arteries of the empire. It did not respect walls. It did not care which god was honored. It only required bodies close enough to share breath. Rome, which had lived for generations in the illusion that it had tamed chance, met an adversary that did not negotiate. In the capital, the plague changed the city's sound first. Fewer footsteps at dawn, more carts in the streets at night, doors shut against neighbors, the temples crowded, not with gratitude but with bargaining. It changed the smell next: the sharpness of vinegar, the sweetness of incense, the acrid smoke of hurried pyres. An ancient city could accommodate death because it expected it. But this death came in volume, and volume changes meaning. It turns private grief into public logistics. The state had to keep counting: how many men for the legions, how many laborers for the docks, how many hands for the harvest. When the counts fell, the next counts fell faster. Grain that was not harvested became hunger. Hunger became movement. Movement became disorder. Disease reached the army at the same time the army was being asked to do more. Rome had built its frontier system like a line of doors. Each province, each client kingdom, each fort and garrison was supposed to absorb pressure. But pressure now arrived with a new quality. Across the northern frontiers, along the Rhine and Danube, people were shifting, some fleeing other peoples, some chasing better land, some driven by the simple arithmetic of survival. Rome had always dealt with barbarians, the convenient word for anyone beyond its administrative reach. It dealt with them by trade, treaties, bribes, threats, and occasional punishment. It could even absorb them as settlers or soldiers when it suited the state. Now the movement had scale. In the late 160s, reports piled up like floodwater. Tribes that had been kept at distance appeared nearer. Allied groups asked for permission to cross. Others crossed without asking. There were skirmishes that felt like raids until they did not. Forts were tested. A line that had been a symbol became, again, a battlefield. Marcus left Rome. He left the world of marble and speeches and entered the world that had been designed to remain out of sight. The Danube frontier was not one place. It was a long, restless zone of river forts, marshes, forests, and roads that existed mainly to feed soldiers. The emperor came not as a conqueror, but as a guarantor that the system would hold. At Carnuntum, an important base on the Danube not far from where Vienna would later stand, imperial power took on its frontier shape. Decisions were made with boots on. Staff officers and governors crowded into tents, arguing about the movement of units and the reliability of local allies. Supplies were counted and recounted. Scouts returned with contradictory reports, and the contradictions had to be turned into action anyway. The war did not offer the pleasures Rome associated with war: a single enemy, a final battle, a surrender. It was a grinding contest of movement and endurance. The emperor's presence mattered, but not because he was a tactical genius. It mattered because the emperor's presence was the state. Where he went, authority condensed. Where he stayed away, authority thinned into rumor. Lucius Verus came north too, at least for a time. The co-emperorship that had looked elegant on coinage now had to function in mud. It did not last long. In 169, Lucius died suddenly while traveling, perhaps of illness, perhaps of stroke, perhaps simply one more casualty in an age when bodies failed without warning. He was brought back to Rome for burial, and Marcus, now sole ruler, absorbed the full weight he had tried to distribute. The death removed a political complication, but it also removed a buffer. If Marcus fell, there would be no adult colleague to steady the succession. The state, which pretended that office was everything, always returned to flesh and blood at moments like this. It was during these years, when the world felt reduced to marching orders and casualty lists, that Marcus began writing the notes that would survive him. They were written in Greek, the language of philosophy and education, and they read like a man trying to keep his mind from sliding into hatred. He did not write, "Be brave," as if bravery were an ornament. He wrote, "Be reasonable," as if reason were a rope thrown across a chasm. In 170, the war found its way into Italy itself. For centuries, Italy had been protected by distance and by the habit of Roman dominance. The frontiers existed so that Romans could forget fear. Now tribes crossed the Alps and pushed into the peninsula, reaching the rich northern plains and besieging Aquileia, the great city near the head of the Adriatic. Panic moved faster than armies. In Rome, senators who had spent their lives treating war as a provincial inconvenience suddenly understood that geography could be pierced. The old vocabulary returned. Hannibal, the ghost name for any threat that reached Italy. But this was not Hannibal. It was something less dramatic and more destabilizing, proof that the frontier system could be overwhelmed. Marcus responded with what the age demanded: mobilization and money. The plague had already thinned revenues. War required pay, arms, and the endless expense of transport. The sources tell of measures that feel like a ruler stripping his own house to keep the roof from collapsing. An auction of imperial possessions, perhaps, the sale of luxury goods and ornaments. The enlistment of men who would not normally have been enrolled, the use of gladiators as soldiers, the pulling of recruits from places that previously had not been touched. Some of these details come through the haze of later biographical writing, which loved moral examples and theatrical gestures. Yet the underlying reality is beyond dispute. The empire was spending itself not on expansion, but on survival. The emperor, who could have played the role of distant majesty, was forced into the role of allocator. deciding what could be sacrificed. In the north, the wars continued in waves. There were victories that looked impressive in dispatches and indecisive on the ground. There were treaties made with one group even as another attacked. There were moments of startling violence, Roman punitive campaigns, burning villages, taking hostages, resettling populations. A state that prided itself on law found itself practicing, again, the oldest form of governance, fear. Here, Marcus's reputation becomes difficult to hold in one hand. The private notes are full of mildness and restraint. The public policy required harshness. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine a pure philosopher. It is harder to imagine a man who can write about compassion at night and authorize slaughter in the morning. Yet the world of emperors did not permit purity. It permitted only choices made under constraint. In 172, the campaign season brought one of those episodes that later generations would transform into a miracle. The army, marching in brutal heat and short of water, was supposedly saved by a sudden storm, rain that revived the Romans and thunder that panicked their enemies. Roman sources celebrated it as divine favor. Christian writers later claimed it as the power of Christian soldiers praying. Others attributed it to a magician. The details differ, as they always do when propaganda and memory compete. What matters is that the frontier war produced its own myths on the spot, because men required meaning as much as they required water. Marcus, a cautious man, allowed the myth to be used. Emperors did not have the luxury of dismissing divine interpretations when morale depended on them. Even the most philosophical ruler understood that the army marched on stories as well as on grain. By the mid-70s, another threat arose, not from the forests across the river, but from within the empire's own command structure. Avidius Cassius, a successful general in the east, was proclaimed emperor by his troops. The rebellion was brief, and its motives remain tangled in rumor. Some accounts suggest that false news of Marcus's death spread and created a vacuum. Others emphasize Cassius's ambition. Still others point to the court politics surrounding the Empress Faustina, Marcus's wife. Ancient history often offers motives the way it offers statues, simplified and posed. What is clearer is Marcus's response. The rebellion forced him to decide how an emperor should treat betrayal when the state is already exhausted. He could unleash terror, confiscations, executions, the cleansing violence that Roman politics knew well. Or he could attempt something rarer, containment. Marcus set out east, leaving the frontier again, moving through the empire like a man carrying the weight of its nerves. Cassius was killed by his own men before Marcus arrived, and his severed head was sent as proof. Marcus refused to look at it for long. He issued orders that limited reprisals. He burned some of Cassius's papers without reading them, according to one tradition, as if to deny himself the poisonous pleasure of discovering enemies. Mercy can be philosophy. It can also be strategy. An empire held together by fear must keep increasing the dose. An empire held together by habit and legitimacy can sometimes survive on restraint. Marcus had to think not only of justice, but of the precedent that would outlive him. The eastern journey carried him into cities that still bore the glamour of Hellenistic culture: Athens with its schools, Asia Minor with its temples and theaters. Marcus was deeply formed by Greek education, and he treated philosophy not as decoration, but as a civic resource. He supported the intellectual institutions of the Greek world, endowed teaching posts, and attended lectures when circumstances allowed. It seems, from the outside, like a return to the life he might have preferred, but there was no return. Even in the East, the empire was sick. The plague had not vanished. It flared and subsided, leaving behind demographic scars that did not heal on command. The frontier, meanwhile, waited. It always waited. When Marcus returned to Rome in 176, he allowed the city to celebrate. There was a triumph, the traditional procession that turned war into theater and suffering into civic pride. Captives were displayed, spoils were paraded. The people cheered the image of strength restored. Rome, always hungry for reassurance, fed on it. Yet beneath the ritual, the logic of the reign had already shifted. Marcus did not rule as a man who could choose projects. He ruled as a man who responded to pressures. It was in these years that his son Commodus moved decisively into public life. Commodus had been born in 161, the year Marcus took power, as if to embody continuity. Rome loved such coincidences. Marcus named him Caesar while still a boy, and later raised him to the rank of co-emperor. In part, this was practical. The adoptive succession that had served Rome so well relied on the ability to choose heirs freely. But by Marcus's time, that freedom had narrowed. The aristocracy expected a natural son when one existed. The army, too, liked bloodlines. And Marcus, exhausted by years of crisis, may have wanted to secure the transition while he still lived. It was also, perhaps, an act of hope or of denial. A father can see what an emperor cannot admit. Commodus grew up in the palace, surrounded by servants, flatterers, and the peculiar loneliness of those raised for power. He did not inherit the same temperament. Where Marcus turned inward and demanded discipline, Commodus seemed drawn to display and sensation. His tastes leaned toward the arena and the adoration of crowds. The contrast did not yet define policy, but it was present like a warning, a dissonant note beneath the triumphal music. Around the same time, the empire's religious tensions sharpened. Christian communities had grown in the cities and provinces, and they occupied an ambiguous space. They were not merely another cult among many. They refused sacrifice to the traditional gods and to the emperor's divine image, and their refusal was read by authorities as stubbornness at best and treasonous impiety at worst. In periods of stability, such differences could be tolerated or ignored. In periods of fear, plague, war, uncertainty, difference becomes scapegoat. Persecutions occurred in Marcus's reign, including the famous violence at Lugdunum in Gaul, where Christians were arrested, tortured, and killed in public spectacle. The extent of Marcus's personal involvement is hard to measure. The Roman state did not require an emperor to sign each death sentence. Provincial governors acted within legal norms and local pressures. Yet the climate of the reign mattered. An emperor who prized order, who depended on the gods' favor as a public language, and who ruled amid crisis, could not easily champion a group seen as refusing the social glue of ritual. It is one of the reign's quiet tragedies that a man who wrote about universal kinship also presided over a society that could turn cruelty into entertainment and righteousness into accusation. The empire's moral life did not improve because the emperor had a good philosophy. It improved only when institutions changed, and Rome's institutions were built for dominance, not for tenderness. By 178, the frontier wars called again. Marcus and Commodus went north together. The decision to bring the young co-emperor to the front was political education and risk at once. It was meant to show the army its future ruler. It was also a test, whether the son could inhabit the reality the father had been forced to live. The Danube in these later years was a place of grim familiarity. Camps rebuilt, roads maintained, treaties made and broken. The enemies had names, Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, but the name mattered less than the pattern. Pressure, response, temporary relief, renewed pressure. The emperor's days were filled with audiences, envoys begging for settlement, commanders requesting reinforcements, administrators reporting shortages. His nights were filled with the private work of keeping the mind from hardening into contempt. The ancient sources suggest that Marcus planned ambitious reorganizations of the frontier, perhaps even new provinces carved out of conquered territory. Such plans make sense. Rome solved problems by turning them into administration, by planting forts and tax collectors where once there had been only war. Whether Marcus would have succeeded is unknowable, because the body that held these plans in mind began to fail. He was never robust. The years of travel, cold, stress, and possibly recurring illness wore him down. In the last winter of his life, the camp's noises would have sounded to him not merely tired, but distant, as if already receding. He continued to issue orders, to listen, to judge. An emperor did not retire. The office consumed the man until the man ended. In 180, Marcus Aurelius died on campaign, far from the Rome that would later claim him as a symbol. The exact location is given differently by different traditions: Vindobona, Sirmium, a camp along the frontier, because ancient memory often preserves the outline and blurs the specifics. What is clear is that his death came not in ceremony, but in the same kind of practical, exhausted setting that had defined the reign. Commodus inherited at once. The transition was swift, as Marcus had intended, but the new emperor's instincts were different, and the state's situation was precarious. Commodus chose peace with the frontier peoples and returned to Rome. Many soldiers approved, many senators muttered, many provincials simply hoped the respite would last. It was a choice that revealed how fragile the empire's confidence had become. The war had not ended because its causes were resolved. It ended because the ruler wished to stop paying its cost. Rome welcomed Commodus with games, and the capital's appetite for spectacle resumed its old dominance. The frontier, however, remained what it had become: a place where pressure could return quickly, where the state's authority could be tested again, where the empire's margin had been permanently reduced. Marcus's reputation began its second life, the one that would outlast the politics. The notes he wrote to himself were never meant to be public. They were the kind of writing a man makes when he assumes no reader, when he is speaking only to the part of himself that wavers. Yet they survived, copied, carried, read. Over time they became a monument more durable than any statue, a portrait of an emperor who tried to master himself. It is tempting, when reading those pages, to imagine a gentle reign, an emperor-philosopher reigning from a place of stillness. The mind does this instinctively. It prefers coherence. It likes to match the calmness of the words to the calmness of the world. The world Marcus Aurelius lived in offers no such match. He ruled through war in the east and long war in the north. He ruled through a plague that thinned the empire's population and strained its finances. He ruled through rebellion and suspicion. He ruled through the moral ugliness that crisis pulls into daylight: scapegoating, public cruelty, the casual grinding of the weak. He ruled with a Senate that needed reassurance, an army that needed pay and victories, provinces that needed protection, and a bureaucracy that could not create surplus out of thin air. In such a reign, a man's philosophy is not a decoration. It is a tool, sometimes a shield, sometimes a restraint, sometimes merely a way to survive his own thoughts. Go back, then, to the tent by the river. The emperor writes because the day will demand things that tempt him toward impatience and hardness. He writes because the war will not supply the consolation of an ending. He writes because men will die and then be replaced, and the replacements will arrive sick. He writes because an empire cannot be governed by hope alone, and because despair is a kind of laziness. Outside, in the dark, the sentries watch the far bank. Fires flicker and vanish among the trees. The river keeps moving under its crust of ice. The camp keeps breathing, coughing, hammering, waiting for dawn. Inside, Marcus Aurelius writes a sentence to himself and then another, as if building a small private order against the disorder he cannot remove. He does not write to become wise. He writes to remain usable,